It's been over a month since the release of Disney Lorcana's fourth set, Ursula's Return. Since then, we've had a challenge in Chicago which has set the stage for the meta, but today we're going to look at what might be different in Charlie's Collectible Show's $10,000 tournament, where hopefully we can answer the question of, is this meta really solved? Just to preface, as of recording, the top 8 has not been played out yet, so the decks are in order of final Swiss standings. I'll order the decks by final placements in the description of the video down below. Alright, first up we have James Gray with a Sapphire Steel no wheel list. This is super on topic as we've just had an interview with Sky regarding the omission of a whole new world for blue steel lists. And this is the only blue steel list in top 8 and it's decided to not run wheel. So that maybe could say something for that part of the deck. But however, this list is fairly different from Sky's list. There's more of a focus on draw and removal than there is in Sky's list, which is a much more proactive list. So I would assume this list has a bit of an easier time dealing with cards like Diablo. This is because we are running 2 Maurice's Workshop for extra draw power. Again, this allows us to play removal. And how Maurice's Workshop works is that every time we play an item, we can pay 1 to draw an extra card. So with a Maurice's Workshop on board, a Popsicle is a pay 1 to draw 1, or you can pay 2 to draw 2. And if you have multiple Maurice's Workshops on board, you can choose to trigger them one at a time until you find the card you need. So it works really, really well when you have a certain amount, when you have like maybe 7, 8, 9 ink and you're trying to look for like a 5, 6 ink card to play. Yeah, so as we said, because of the extra draw, we can fit in more removal. In this case, we are running 4 copies of Bochum as a great counter to Diablo, and 2 Brooms as more of a proactive counter to Diablo to play a card on board. Normally, you can only play so many Babooms with a whole new world because you're able to draw lots of extra cards. But in this case, hopefully we have enough draw power between the Maurice's Workshop and Haram's that we can afford to give up these slots to removal. As part of that extra removal, we are also running Zeus, a very, very good card. We can sing it with our 4 costs and above, so we've got plenty of those, with our Haram and our 5 costs as ways to remove key threats in the mid-game. And even just a hard cast from hand to remove a key threat, especially to prevent a beast from drawing extra cards like an Emerald Steel. However, it is a song, so it can be discarded. It's not something you'd ever want to keep in your mulligan opening hand, especially against Emerald. And lastly, rather than running the Hades like we see in Sky's list, we are running 2 copies of Let It Go. The difference is it is singable and inkable, but it does not come with a body. So it's a great out to Tamatoa, but because it doesn't come with a body, it's really a bad card in most other situations, as Tamatoa is the only big threat you'd be wanting to remove with this. And finally, the last difference from the list we looked at in the interview with Sky is that they're running 2 Beast Hard-Headed. So this is, again, a very, very, very great mirror counter and red-blue counter to remove Quills and Dimes, just like we have Let It Go for Tamatoa. Overall, this is a really solid deck, and I think this sort of direction we're starting to steer with the top 8 list in Blue Steel really shows that maybe it is time to abandon the whole new world, as most decks in the meta are going to benefit from you giving them a whole new hand of 7 cards. Next up, we have Brian Hevlow on Emerald Steel, Bucky, Diablo Discard, everyone's most hated deck right now. And I think the reason it's a very, very popular pick is probably because the Rat won the Chicago DLC with it. So really, this meta has become, can you beat Emerald Steel? If you can't, can you beat Red Blue? If you can't, you're not a viable deck, right? You have to beat at least one of them, and if you could beat 2, if you could beat both of them, then you've probably solved the meta. I was going to say the key difference to Brian's deck, but actually they're both called Brian, so we'll just say the key difference to the Rat's deck is the cutting of Sudden Chill and a few other tech cards to run a more consistent core, and along with that removal, we've added in the 4 Tinkerbells and 2 Grab Your Swords as a mirror counter package. This is a great way to remove opposing Buckies and Diablos, especially when, again, Emerald Steel is so popular right now. If you're going to be bringing the list, you want to be teching for the mirror so that you have a better chance than just a coin flip. Now, there's always pros and cons when it comes to deck building. In this case, I think the removal of Sudden Chill makes me wonder if the red and blue steel matchup is significantly worsened, as your main way to beat them is by preventing them from utilizing their deck's extra resource potential. So by discarding a bunch of their cards, you're hopefully preventing them from ramping, preventing them from drawing extra cards, and playing those big cards and inking higher and higher, right, with those resources. So without the Sudden Chill, our only way of discarding is the 4 copies of Ursula and the natural Bucky discard. So if you can't get a double Bucky out, without the Sudden Chills, I think you're going to have a very, very hard time discarding your opponent's hand through a Haram setup on board. And with no you know, with Haram being a 1/6 and no good way to remove Haram, you might find yourself missing the sudden chills in those matchups. Other than that though, this is a really strong and consistent core that has proven itself time and time again in multiple top cuts in set 4, and it is no wonder that they've made it to top 8. Just to explain a bit more about the deck here if you haven't kept up with the meta, because I realize not everyone's, you know, keeping an eye on these tournaments every day, right? The core idea of how this deck works is that you want to be putting out your 1-drop on turn 1. That could be Diablo, that could be Robin Hood. Diablo tends to work best if you know you have a Bucky coming turn 2, because then on turn 2 you can shift into your Diablo, trigger the discard, and by playing with small Diablo first, you can actually check your opponent's hand to see if they're going to have an answer to your Diablo. And, you know, the whole idea of that is that once you have the Bucky set up, you trigger that first discard. Every turn after that, you're going to be playing a Floodborn to trigger another discard. So that's going to be a Floodborn Aladdin on 3. This card also gets rid of items. Could also be just another Diablo. And if you didn't play the small Diablo and instead you played the small Robin Hood, you could shift onto the large Robin Hood here. That's another way to trigger the discard, still pressure on the board. And once you've removed all your opponent's resources, you're looking to close out the game with a card like Flynn Rider. And obviously we have some other tools in here, like the Beast to draw cards for some extra consistency. Jafar's a turn 4 Floodborn that can also draw cards and trigger the discard. And then finally we have our removal cards. The Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire package can be double sung by the Ursula. They don't have Sudden Chill, but that's still 7 cards that synergize with Singing Ursula if you can make it stick onto the board. Especially with less smash in the meta, I think the Singing Ursula has a lot higher chance to survive. Finally, we have We Don't Talk About Bruno. It's Emerald's new amazing removal card because it also triggers a discard. So if your opponent has no cards in hand, it's basically a singable, inkable Dragonfire. Alright, and I think that's about it for the deck. Next up is John Rowe, again with another Emerald Steel Bucky Diablo discard. I promise you we will be seeing some variety soon. The Bird Rat duo obviously is very prevalent since we're seeing it multiple times with top 8. But there does seem to be a lot of spice in this list. There are way more tech cards. But one that stands out to me the most is the 4 copies of Hidden Cove. A possible reason for the extra inclusions of this card, which is usually used as just a 2-card tech to get around the strength and toughness thresholds for removal cards like Medusa and Grab Your Sword, is to deal with the rise of locations like Queen's Castle. By giving your small cards extra stats on the board, you can more easily deal with a castle on the board, whereas previously Castle and Micduck Manor were a pretty great way to counter Emerald Steel, as the 7 willpower is very, very tough for them to deal with, as they all have quite low strength cards. So Hidden Cove is a great way of getting around that, without needing to run a very bricky tech card like Rise of Titans. As you can see in this list, we've included 3 copies of Baboom. This is a very good early game Diablo counter, especially when on the draw, and since it's inkable, you don't have to use it every game if it isn't relevant. So as we've seen in the other list, they decided to go for 2 Grab Your Sword and 4 Tinkerbell. That wouldn't apply until a bit later in the game, but in this case with the Babooms, you can deal with the Diablo threat a lot earlier on and prevent your opponent from drawing so many cards. We are back to the 3 copies of Sudden Chill. We saw the Rat on in Chicago, which pairs greatly with Singing Ursula, as you can wipe out your opponent's entire hand if the Ursula is not answered. Emerald Steel truly is the question deck for meta that everyone needs answers to, with cards like Diablo, Bucky, Singing Ursula. If your deck doesn't have an answer to multiple, if not all of these cards, then it's going to really struggle in the current meta. This is why even the Emerald Steel decks themselves are running answers to themselves, because the mirror is so common. That's why a card like Baboom is so strong. Again, more mirror tech. We have 1 copy of Big Tinkerbell, presumably as another anti-Bucky tech for deal 1 damage, dealing with 1 or multiple Buckies. We do also see, though, 2 copies of Rise of Titan. So along with the 4 Hidden Coves, I doubt John was having much trouble with Queen's Castle. They have many, many, many answers to it. So this should, and I think Queen's Castle and Micduck Manor, these location cards are going to be more and more prevalent. Recently, they've been purported to be one of the best counters to both the Emerald Steel and Red-Blue strategies. It seems like Emerald Steel is already adapting. So as we see, metas are very cyclical. Maybe we'll see people stop running locations now that people are including more copies of Hidden Cove and more Rise of Titans. And finally, what is really interesting to me is 4 copies of Big Pegasus, but without any of the shift targets, so that line of text you are never ever going to be using in the deck. So this means that John thinks that the evasive free Floodborn that quests for 2 is good enough to play on its own. And honestly, I can see this as cards like Smash are seeing less play, and most removal cards are focusing on dealing 1 and 2 damage. So unless you're having an opponent do a Tink Grab Your Sword combo to deal 3 to the whole board, then Pegasus is probably going to live. And really, with Hidden Cove, Pegasus would live that anyway. We're really starting to see the synergy of some of these cards play out here, and with how prevalent evasives are, Pegasus is also a good card to trade into opposing Diablos. Again, pair that with a Hidden Cove. If your opponent has a Hidden Cove, the free stat line is very strong. We have yet another Diablo discard in top 8. I promise this is the last one, but at least this one is spicy with its text too. It is piloted by Chinhmong Yang, and with only 2 copies of Small Diablo. I suppose they don't really feel the need for the shift line as often as they want the Robin Hood line, or they just wanted to fit in some more of these tech cards. And with 3 copies of Hidden Cove, we're seeing a sort of balance between the other 2 lists we've seen here. Hidden Cove is obviously a very strong card. It's just hard to find the right ratio, as it's not the kind of card you want to play on curve. If you play too many, you could end up bricking your early hands when you want cards that have more proactive potential. Hidden Cove is a resilience card. It's only really good once you're already ahead on tempo and you've built up the board. Unless, obviously, you're avoiding certain key threats. We do see Sudden Chill included, but it's with only 2 copies this time. So much like the deck that omitted Sudden Chill, we're going to be a bit more reliant on our Ursulas and our Bucky triggers in order to discard our opponent's hand. We appear to have cut a couple copies of Strength of a Raging Fire to fit in Avalanche, an amazing tech card for both Bucky and locations like Queen's Castle and McDuck's Manor. If you're not familiar with this card, it's a 4-cost uninkable, deal 1 damage to, I believe, 3 characters. I'm going to double check that. It's a good thing I double check myself, because it's actually deal 1 damage to each opposing character, so much like the Tinkerbell effect, plus you get to ban an opposing's location. Plus you get to banish an opposing location. This is really showing how much of a threat Queen's Castle especially has become in the meta, so people are more and more having to include tech cards to deal with it. What's so interesting about Avalanche as a tech card is that it techs for both locations like Queen's Castle and the mirror for opposing Buckies, so normally an uninkable tech card is a bit rough to play, as tech cards are for specific matchups, so you don't really want to play an uninkable one, as if it's in a matchup where you don't need it, it just sort of bricks your hand. But in this case, this as a tech card covers so many matchups, maybe every deck except for red-blue, but it's probably relevant enough on its own with only running 2 copies of it. Next up, for more interesting and really quite ingenious text, we have a singular copy of I Find 'em, I Flatten 'em. It is a 4-cost inkable Be Prepared that instead of banishing all opposing characters, banishes all opposing items. This is perfectly suited for shutting down the draw engines of opposing Sapphire lists like we're seeing in the meta now. Especially with Blue Steel running 8 popsicles essentially, to be able to wipe all of those, plus Fishbone Quill, plus Flattened Dime. This card is very efficient and definitely worth the 1 tech slot. We're also seeing 3 copies of the Shift Pegasus, again without the shift line. So again, multiple Emerald Steel players seem to think this is a very strong card, regardless of the shift evasive effect. We also have 2 copies of Cricky, one of my favorite Emerald tech cards from meta. I ran it in my Emerald Amber list earlier in the set. And this card is great for trading up into larger characters and location cards. So, I mean, this deck seems very prepared for locations, much like the previous Emerald Steel list was. We're really again seeing the cyclical nature of the meta. As locations come in to be a good answer, people react to those locations, and now it might even be bad to include locations in the deck. So it'll be really interesting to see if Bochum follows these meta trends that we've been seeing in America. Again, middling between the 2 other lists. First list ran 4 Big Tinkerbell. That's 4, not 3. Next list ran 1 Big Tinkerbell. Here we are seeing 2 Big Tinkerbell. So again, with the 2 Avalanches, we are seeing lots and lots of ways to deal with opposing Buckies, because Emerald Steel seems to have such a high representation, especially in these top cuts, despite how expensive the deck is, that you really do need to tech for it. And finally, I think the most spicy inclusion of all is a single copy of Under the Sea. This card can hit multiple key targets in the game like Bucky, Diablo, Haram, and Cogsworth. The only tough bit is having enough ink or singers to play it, and since it's uninkable, it could easily clog your hand, and as a song can be discarded by Ursula. Very interesting tech card. I'd be curious to know how often it came up during their run. So if you are watching this, please let me know in the comment. Next up is Noimnot on Ruby Amethyst. They are one of the most renowned players in Disney Lorcana, a master of Ruby Amethyst, and also the player with the highest win rate on Pixelborn, with over 1,917 games, I guess exactly 1,917 games, at a 67.97% win rate, which is absolutely nuts for a card game where even a 60% win rate is considered quite strong. Now, they have brought a fairly standard set 4 red-purple list, so let's just go over some basics here. Firstly, we have an early aggression package and cycle cards in the form of Chernobog's Followers and Magic Broom. We can push in a lore or two while also maintaining our hand size as a counter to Bucky discard to give us some breathing room to sort of scale up to our Be Prepared to reset the board. And on the note of aggression, we are also running the very popular set 4 Flynn Rider Sisu package, which if left unchecked will generate free lore every single turn. In combination with the 4 Goats and 4 Queens Castle, this deck certainly has the ability to race into the slower Sapphire decks, not giving them any time to set up their resource engine. We also see the necessary 4 copies of Brawl to counter the ever-present Diablo meta threat, and with 3 copies of Bee King Undisputed instead of Tremaine, we can hopefully remove those Buckies or other standalone threats like Tamatoa and Cogsworth a little earlier, plus it's singable. That does, again, make it weaker to Ursula, though. But it comes on, even played on its own, it comes on 2 turns earlier than a Tremaine would. And finally, for our removal package, other than the Be King Undisputed, we have 3 Medusa and 4 Be Prepared. Be Prepared, once again, is a very pivotal card in this deck, as it resets the board completely against Emerald Steel. You just don't want to see it in your opening hand, or it might get discarded by Ursula or even just brick your hand. In previous sets, we've seen red-purple running only 3 Be Prepared because of this issue, but I suppose the card is becoming so important for current meta, and especially has so much value into the red-blue and blue-steel matchup, where they're building very, very big, high-cost boards that are hard to deal with, that the 4 copies of Be Prepared are very necessary. Next up is Enrique Eligio on Ruby Sapphire Control, who was inspired by Tomas's Red-Blue in Chicago, as they've decided to run 3 copies of Great Stone Dragon in place of Fishbone Quill. Honestly, this card was such a sleeper pick this set, and I'm glad to see it's found a home as a way to ramp while still maintaining hand size. I'm sure there's more I could say about the card, but I already talked a lot about it in my last tournament report for Chicago, so if you want to hear more about it, go check that out. And honestly, everything else about this deck is very standard, and the list is very tightly engineered to ramp consistently and survive the early game to then stabilize the board and start putting out your larger threats. It's pretty much built how I'd like to build my red-blue list, plus with the inclusion of Great Stone Dragon, which I hadn't gotten a chance to test yet, because obviously it's a lot harder to test games now that we don't have Pixelborn anymore for that online testing. Just to go over some of these basic fundamentals, but I really agree with in this deck, we have our 3 copies of Ice Block to synergize with 4 Medusas and 4 Big Sisus, with 2 Little Sisus to shift on. We're also seeing a return to form of 4 How Far I'll Go. I definitely think this is the correct choice, as you really want to be seeing 1 jump ahead on 2 into either Haram or How Far I'll Go on the next turn. We're seeing a lot of people cut down to 3 or even 2 How Far I'll Go, and I think that's just not the right choice. I think the consistency is super important, especially with such a key card. And obviously, we have our lore game closing package of 2 Lucky Dime and 4 Tamatoa. These cards are pretty much why this deck can play as greedy and as control-based as they want, because even if they fall behind on tempo and fall behind on lore, they can come back in 1 turn with like 14 lore with a Tamatoa plus Dime quest combo. Yeah, I mean, there's not much else to say here. It's a pretty standard red-blue list, but I'm very happy to see Great Stone Dragon in a top cut again. Now we have another Ruby Sapphire control list, this time piloted by Tayler Lewis. They're a little bit more traditional with running the 4 Fishbone Quills. What really stands out to me though is that they have completely cut the 4 Develop Your Brain, which has long been touted as a staple of the deck. Honestly, I think this list, you really want that filtering card, especially in the late game with the excess ink to spare. I can understand the idea of cutting it to fit in more cards, but it's, to me, in this list, because you always have that ink to spare to play Develop Your Brain, it feels like the same argument is going, why don't I go to 64 cards so I can fit in 4 extra cards? The cost of those extra cards is consistency. For Develop Your Brain, for Popsicle, we're running a 52 card deck because we have a very cheap cycle, which lets us get to the next card in our deck. This makes everything more consistent, And, you know, as card game players, we should love consistency, right? Because there's so much variance, you want to do everything you can to mitigate it. These Sapphire lists, where we usually have an extra ink to spare, there's really often no opportunity cost to running a card like Develop Your Brain, and in the late game especially, it can help you filter for the exact answer you need to regain control on board or close out the game. So maybe there's a recipe to their madness, and cutting for Develop Your Brain really did just work for them. But I'm always hesitant to make that kind of assumption, because in theory, Develop Your Brain should be better, right? And when something gives you consistency, it's not always going to be represented in a small sample size like one run at a tournament. Anyway, enough of me getting upset about there not being Develop Your Brain. Let's move on. Instead of running it, Tayler has chosen to run 2 copies of Vitalisphere. This is a card that I haven't used often, but I know some players have been experimenting with it, and by paying 1 and banishing itself, you can give a character Rush +2 attack, which is very helpful for a control deck like Ruby Sapphire. Another choice, as I mentioned earlier, looking at the previous list, is that I do raise my eyebrow a little bit at the 2 copies of How Far I'll Go. I think it makes a bit more sense in the Fishbone Quill version, because we still have Quill for ramp, but I'd still be hesitant to run less than 4, considering how important it is to Red Blue's ideal line and ability to ramp while filtering for answers to the board. But overall on this list, it looks like Tayler has opted less for consistency and more for just having more cards in their deck as more answers to different scenarios. One of the other differences in the deck, actually, is that again, talking about consistency, instead of running 4/4 Flynn Rider and Sisu, they're running 3/3 Flynn Rider and Sisu. Honestly, this makes a lot of sense to me, as the Flynn Rider Sisu line is sort of a backup to the main 1 jump ahead ramp line. There's not a massive reason to be running 4 and 4 of both, because it's not your ideal play. And finally, for the last difference to the other Red-Blue list, for our removal package, the ratios Tayler has decided to run is free Medusa, free Be Prepared, and free Big Sisu. Our final top 8 deck is from Luca, Serano on Ruby Amethyst. The core is mostly figured out this set, pretty much the same as Noimnot's list, bar a free card difference. Those free cards being that Luca has chosen to drop the Magic Brooms and only run 4 Chernobog's followers in the 1-drop slot. The downside of dropping these free Magic Brooms is that it's probably going to make the Emerald Steel matchup worse. By having less cycle, we're less able to maintain our hand size against the discard. But instead of running those cards, Luca has decided to invest it into 2 copies of Lady Tremaine and 1 copy of Bee King Undisputed. With that extra removal, it should help into the red-blue and blue-steel matchups. So what we're really seeing in this very tiny free card difference, right, is a philosophy change between the 2 decks. In Noimnot's case, they've gone for a more balanced list, where they're hedging their bad matchup into Emerald Steel so that they have the highest chance of winning overall. However, in Luca's case, they've gone, hey, if I'm going to lose the Emerald Steel matchup anyway, I might as well make my good matchups better, being Red, Blue, and Blue Steel, and just dodge the Emerald Steel and the Swiss and make it to day 2 and hopefully go all the way, right? So in this case, there are 3 Emerald Steel in the top cut, but if Luca successfully dodges them and only gets matched into Red, Blue, and Red, Purple, this deck building decision would really pay off. And honestly, that is what Ursula's Return Set 4 meta has been all about. It's about those 4 tier 1 decks. You're either going to build to beat Red Blue, or you're going to build to beat Emerald Steel. And if you were able to build to beat both of them, you would have solved the meta. But in this case, you have to figure out the pros and cons and decide which matchups you're going to hedge for, and if you're just going to roll the dice in the Swiss, or go for a more balanced matchup profile. In this case, the tournament was best of 3, which I think lends itself to having a more balanced profile. However, in the 2-game format at the official challenges, it sort of lends itself to having more polarizing matchups, as it's so important to get 2-0s. You really want to be able to win on the play and the draw in your good matchups, but you could accept maybe a loss or 2 into a bad matchup as long as you could dodge it the rest of the tournament and only get 2-0s and 1-1s into the good matchups. But the argument for having a more balanced profile is that if you hedge your bad matchups, then you could turn that loss into a 1-1. But again, these tournaments, with how the top cuts have been so far, really seem to be more about getting as many 2-0s as possible. In my case, when I played in Lille, I missed out on top cut with 4 wins and 5 ties, not a single loss. So being able to convert one of those ties into a 2-0 would have meant I could make it to day 2. So until that bonus point gets removed, I think you really have to keep in mind that sometimes it's better to have a polarizing matchup and just hope you dodged the bad one. In conclusion, since Disney Lorcana Chicago, we're starting to see a lot of optimizations, but we're not yet seeing any crazy innovations perform. But I do have faith that much like Atlanta and Lille, we are likely to see innovations in Bochum that'll shake up the meta, especially for those of you who are going to be keeping a close eye on our tournament to see what you want to bring to the challenge in Toronto. It's a very exciting time to be a Disney Lorcana player, especially now that we don't have Pixelborn. These tournament reports are the best way to keep up with the meta, so I'll make sure to keep bringing you the news and analysis. Thanks for watching.